Welcome and good evening. My name is Ron Christie, and on behalf of the John Brademas Center of New York University, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Constitution Day celebration this evening. Now, let me start by giving special thanks to our partners from the Verbatim Performance Lab at NYU Steinhardt for putting this program together, as well as our promotional partners at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network of NYU Law. Of course, a special thanks to all of the VPL team members who contributed to the creation of Dare I Use the Word, as well as to our respondents who will be joining me in conversation following the performance. Dean Jack Knott of NYU Steinhardt and Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver, the Associate Vice President for Global Faculty Engagement and Innovation Advancement at NYU. And I am really looking forward both to our conversation and discussion, but most importantly, the engagement with our audience tonight. As many of you know, the citizens of the United States have celebrated both Independence Day and President's Day since the 1870s. But 1995, thanks to the leadership of the late Senator Byrd from West Virginia, America began to celebrate Constitution Day. Also known as Citizenship Day, Constitution Day is an American holiday honoring the day that 39 delegates to the Constitutional Convention actually signed the US Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And these were delegates ranging in age from Jonathan Dayton at age 26 to Benjamin Franklin at 81. And my NYU DC students will of course tell you from our class last night, this is something very much in the foremost forefront of our conversation. We're thrilled once again to be with you tonight, and without further ado, let me turn the program over to Joe Salvatore to introduce the performance. Good evening, Joe. Over to you.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to collaborate with all of you on this Constitution Day celebration. I'm the director of the Verbatim Performance Lab, which is a project of the Program in Educational Theater at NYU Steinhardt. We create verbatim documentary theater by performing the words and gestures of real people collected from found media artifacts and interview-based data. Through the investigations of these performances, we aim to disrupt assumptions, biases, and intolerances across a spectrum of political, cultural, and social narratives. Given that this year is the 230th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, we questioned how the First Amendment resonates in 2021, given the events of January 6th and contemporary cancel culture, particularly as it relates to the provisions regarding freedom of speech and the right to peaceably assemble. Dare I Use the Word is our response to that question. It's part of an ongoing series called Portraits US, which aims to capture the experiences and viewpoints of people throughout the United States during historical events and happenings. Last spring, we collaborated with two groups of students from NYU Steinhardt's Creating Ethnodrama and Documentary Theater course to conduct interviews with participants from around the country about contemporary cancel culture and the events of January 6th. In both cases, we wanted to understand how an individual's political and personal ideologies and their identities influence their opinions and beliefs about these topics. Over the summer, we reviewed over 40 interviews collected by the students and selected excerpts from 10 of them. We then assigned those excerpts to professional actors in our core ensemble, and they each studied the interview transcript and the audio and video recording of their participant to learn their original speech and gestural patterns as closely as possible. They then performed those patterns verbatim, literally word for word and gesture for gesture. Because of current COVID protocols, the actors have recorded their performances in their own homes using their own equipment. We then arranged the 10 individual performances into a 25-minute video that you're about to see. Before each individual performance, you'll see a title card that provides an identifier chosen by the participant at the time of their interview and a title for the piece taken from their spoken text. The title, Dare I Use the Word, also comes from the actual spoken words of one of the participants. So we encourage you to listen for when that phrase comes up. For all 10 excerpts, we cast actors across identity so that they portray a person who is of a different race, ethnicity, gender identity, and/or age than they are. This allows the actor to investigate and potentially empathize with the lived experience of another, and we collect the actor's responses to track that possibility. We also wonder how it affects your experiences as audience members. As you're watching this evening, we encourage you to notice how you respond to each of the 10 participants as you experience their words and gestures delivered by actors with different identities. After the screening, our respondents will share their thoughts, and we'll also drop a survey link into the Zoom chat to collect some of your immediate thoughts and responses as well. Thanks again to the Bradamus Center and to the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for their support and sponsorship of this event. And thanks to all of you for choosing to join us this evening. Let's go ahead and start the video.
The Bill of Rights, ratified December 15th, 1791.
Amendment 1.
Congress shall make no law
respecting an establishment of religion,
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
or abridging the freedom of speech,
Or of the press.
Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble.
and to petition the government
for a redress of grievances.
I would say, listen, the conditions were so people came to protest what they believed to be an unfair or a stolen election. Fine. As an American, I love that we can say what we think in an ostensibly in a safe way. So a lot of people gathered together on this day. The location was deliberate because the decision about the election was being made just down the way. And that, I don't know if a fourth grader would get all this, but I think the conditions were set for violence to occur. There was a growing group of people that were very unsettled, and there was an emotional response that was incited directly and indirectly by the President of the United States at the time. And it led to the violence. It led to an attack on our own soil by our own people. And people died, and it was unthinkable prior to that. And I don't know. It makes me emotional to even try to think about explaining it in the future.
I mean, it ultimately made me feel angry, but my main response was frustration at the fact that this could even happen. And I think, I don't really remember the time frame, but I remember going to work after that and talking to some of the more conservative patrons that are at the pool, and just kind of stating my opinion that if you had any part of that or supported any of the events that happened there, you're not a good person. And it's like you're not for actual betterment of the country. You're just supporting some chaos that doesn't need to happen. Like, it's just... So it was nice to have those conversations with sort of like-minded people among conservatives, but yeah, I did lose a lot of contact with a lot of people. Well, it wasn't a lot. It was a few. A few people through Facebook. People like unfriended me after I posted just a status that was saying, if you support anything that happened in the events, then I don't really want to associate with you anymore. And I did lose a few friends that way. But, you know, it is what it is. I prefer not to associate with anyone that supports uneducated chaos.
Well, I had a conversation with someone, and I said it was, I referred to what was going on as like a siege at the Capitol. And someone was saying to me, that's not what it is. That it's just a bunch of protesters. I was like, how can you watch this on television right now and tell me that it's not? Like, it's people who are not getting their way, almost being directed by someone, the former president, maybe inadvertently, but being directed to do something, to try and take matters into their own hands, right? And it's just, so anyway, I was having that conversation with this person, and this is why I don't engage in these conversations about politics, is because, or just anything relating to politics in any way, because how can you not watch that as an American and be disappointed, right? Doesn't matter what, you know, what party you identify by or who you voted for, whatever. It just, you know, and then I wonder too, you know, I wonder because, you know, and this is where, like, I try to be open to things. Like, I read a lot of stuff that was talking about, like, Biden supporters and, like, some of the protests that were going on before Biden was elected, and what would have happened if Trump won again. Would things have been like, because then you look at both sides of it. Those guys, those people were probably not sane, first of all, but right to do what they did. But then what would have happened if Trump won? Would there have been more protests? Would there, like, no, in my opinion, there's another line with that, where you can protest for what's right, like, for instance, like Black Lives Matter, and then people who take advantage of a protest like that by looting stores and disrupting businesses that maybe had nothing to do with what was going on. But there's a difference between peaceful protests and then people who just are wanting to rebel and take things, you know? So that's the conversation that I had.
Well, it wasn't so much of a conversation, but it was more like, and I kind of mentioned this when you first reached out, but someone that I went to high school with was posting that he was on social, like that he was at the Capitol, and he spent like the whole like week following the insurrection, like posting about his experience and like trying to like rally more people to like continue to like incite violence. And he has a decent amount of followers. Like, I think he has like 20,000 followers or something like that. So he isn't even like a quiet voice. Like, I think he even launched his own version of Parler, like the social media app or something like that. But he went like on tangents, and then I look back at his post like even before, and he was like it was almost like he was preparing for war. So that was really like, that made me super uncomfortable. And I was like, I can't believe, like, it kind of validated my life experience growing up in small town Pennsylvania, because I was like, I can't believe I know someone who went there and like did that and thought it was not only okay, but like the right thing to do. And the people who weren't doing that were like sheep and falling in line. And like, that like validated my life experience, if that makes sense. Because I was like, I knew the people from my town were nuts. Like, I knew it. So I screenshotted all of his posts and sent it to the FBI because I was like, and he was like posting stuff and like tagging DC. And so people were like commenting on his posts and like tagging the FBI too. So I'm like, I'm not the only person who sent his information to the FBI. But like, he ended up getting arrested, like I think 2 weeks after, maybe a month after. And he got posted on the homegrown terrorist Instagram account that blew up. And it was like, that was kind of crazy. And I was like, I can't believe I know this person and that we like hung out in high school. Like, that's nuts to me. But yeah.
Well, you know, there's a third factor here between free speech and free market. You know, I mean, hate speech, yeah, I mean, hate speech can be covered by free speech. You know what I mean? I remember years ago there was a test case where these Nazis, and this is going back to like maybe the 70s, where this Nazi group wanted to march through a Jewish neighborhood, you know, in Illinois. It's outside of Chicago, and the ACLU defended the Nazis for their right to free speech, and there was a Jewish lawyer who did it. But I think in today's world, we get caught up with like hate speech, and they're claiming their rights to free speech, but there's also the venues, and the venues are privately owned and respond more to market forces. So, you know, you might want to say something on a television show, but the television show has to attract an audience. You know, it has to you know, be able to sell advertising time to sponsors. So you see, that's more of a question of free market. So yeah, but it's a confusing issue. You know, I mean, there's hate speech and you're free. You're free to say whatever you want. The government isn't gonna come down on you, but you might actually be censored. You might be censored on a privately owned platform.
When I saw social media of leaders of small companies, state legislatures, you know, yeah, I don't know, like people that you wouldn't expect to be doing something like that. I would respect like a rebel group. You know, I would expect like a rebel group or like conspiracy theorists, that group to be made of conspiracy theorists. But to look at the news and see that Rudy Giuliani, members of Congress, members of, you know, successful and thriving businesses in other regions like Southern food stores, right? Just for instance, state legislators from like West Virginia and Michigan going down and participating, members of the House of Representatives, kind of being seen in speaking at the rally before this transpired. It just confirmed my thoughts of like, this is a corroborated effort, you know, and there's conversations that are obviously being had, small groups and secret meetings, you know, that are putting the security of not only our political system, but our country, right, at risk for the sake of rooted in the idea of like, hey, we've got to do whatever we can to maintain, you know, a racial power as a majority And that was really bothersome, right? And when I saw that these were elected leaders, this is crazy. What? Wow. Like, I tried hard at that moment to not do too much media, social media, because it's like, boy, I'm gonna get hot and I'm gonna say something, and I know I can't do that.
Um, I think I would describe it as a day that I believe has changed politics for at least a generation. That I think it finished the job of disrupting I think Biden has kind of like reintroduced some of the norms and behaviors and, like protocols of the office. I think that January 6th has let it be known that it's okay. You can try to overthrow the government, or it at a minimum, and let's even take the conservative route. If it wasn't overthrowing the government, it was just trying to get attention. Well, there were people in there looking to kill representatives and senators and the vice president, right? And to the fact that so little has been done for those people to account for what they did. I think it is a green light moment in our history that I think will affect us, like I said initially, for the next, at least the next generation. And more, concretely, I would describe it as a day that I think it depends on who you are, but I think it's surprised, shocked, confirmed a lot of those things for a lot of other people of what our country really is, in a sense, that and it's becoming to me, it was like another step of showing just how, we've talked about division in this country for decades now, but short of the Civil War, I don't, and I know there've been like horrific moments before where we've been divided, but short of actually having a civil war, I feel like it's almost like a cold civil war right now, right? Like everything is like a powder keg. Everything is, and I'm hopeful that we can turn it around before, snowballs out of control. But I just feel like that January 6th, it is like this milestone on this trajectory of, we are so divided that if we don't like the results of the election, no matter what evidence there is or isn't that there was fraud, we are still going to go and try to overthrow our leaders because we don't like what they're, we don't like what we're being told, essentially.
I remember thinking, I don't know how much you know about Seattle's last summer, but right outside of my apartment building after the protests became the Chop Chaz. And it was awful. It was terrible. I've served in the military. I was in combat for 12 months. Kind of felt like an insurgency with like much, much higher stakes and no leadership. But I remember when the police came back and how great that felt and how calm the neighborhood became. And, there weren't people getting shot outside. There weren't people using IV drugs outside of our apartment. There weren't burning cars, burning trash, or anything like that. But I remember this came up in conversation with a couple of friends, and I said, one of the things that I'm really happy about is that Seattle police came back in the East Precinct. And because that was in stark disagreement with their ideology, because they hadn't lived there, and bless their hearts, you know, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. You know, they blocked me on social media. They blocked my number. All because, you know, there was a little more peace and order in the neighborhood. And that's not to say that I disagreed with the Black Lives Matter movement or anything like that. Just making an open-ended statement, having the cops back, a little more order to the neighborhood. Sure. Oh, I mean, like, all the time living in Seattle. You know what I mean? I'm not the best conservative, but I'm certainly not the best liberal at all. You know, I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. But the thing is, you know, I look like a cop. I'm covered in tattoos that are covered now. I very obviously was in the military at first glance. You know, I drive a pickup truck. You gotta be careful in a city that is so, dare I use the word, extreme in their openness to discord, I would say.
Patriotism is a very loaded question for a Spaniard. I remember coming to America and being terrified by the amount of flags, their rabid patriotism, and coming from a country that had gone through a civil war in which alliance to a flag and to a set of principles was equated with fascism. So once Franco left and to in any way talk about, you know, the motherland in any kind of loving terms was seen as a fascist move. And it took me a long time to come here. I remember being very thrown off every single time somebody would like bring out the flag and say, talk about America, it's the best place in the earth. And I would be like, oh, what is going on? That's fascist propaganda. I mean, after a while, I started to realize that there is a difference. You know, I came here very young. I was 16 when I came here. So I think patriotism now is aspirational. First of all, I don't think we are there, but I view patriotism as a desire to create a supportive community within artificial boundaries. I think it's important that it is considered a responsibility that you take upon yourself that is not imposed, that it is outward, that it is something you owe to somebody, to a community, not something a community owes to you, and that we understand there is an artificial boundary and that we have created. And because we have created them, if needed, they have to be modified, or they can be modified. I think the moment that we start to get very rigid, and we start to talk about, you know, outside forces that create this unique group of people, and you start glorifying the group of people above other human beings, you start running into trouble. So that's what patriotism is for me now.
For me, I think when I imagine accountability as a healthy practice, as a healing practice, I think it has to be done by people who are in relationship. So I come from a tradition that believes that if someone wrongs you, you seek to mend because they are your sibling. So there's an assumption here of proximity. They might not be my sibling, but they're like my sibling. The only way for someone to be like my sibling is if we've like been around each other and our nasty, gross, like that's how my sibling knows me, and all of my gross weird strangeness and still accepts me. That person can hold me accountable in a way that will lead to my growth. Instead of holding me, I don't think it's accountable to say, and I now dispose of you. To me, that's not account for someone. That might be account for a thing, right? I can be accountable to this thing and say that when it's done, I will recycle it in the right way and throw it out. But insofar that a human being is alive, I think they deserve more than, and now I'm going to put you in a box. So accounting for people is different. So there's got to be a relationship, there's got to be enough proximity to then be able to go to somebody and say, hey, this is what I'm observing. This is how I've experienced what you did. It hurt. It hurt a lot of people. And now something's got to change. Together, we can figure that out. But it's not going to stay the same. And you're still worthy of love. And you're still worthy of being who you are. I'm not throwing you out. Even though something's got to change. You will not be in that position anymore. You will not have the power that you have. Yeah.
As an American, I love that we can say what we think.
It is what it is.
How can you not watch that as an American and be disappointed?
I knew the people from my town were nuts.
You might actually be censored.
Small groups and secret meetings.
The cold civil war, right?
Kind of felt like an insurgency.
Patriotism now is aspirational.
Hold me accountable in a way that will lead to my growth.
Well, thank you so much to all the actors from the Verbatim Performance Lab for sharing your amazing performances with us. We all give you a hearty, although virtual, round of applause. You did a remarkable job, so congratulations. As we transition into a discussion, our Zoom audience will notice that a link has been dropped into the chat. If you're able to click on that link and take a brief survey, we hope to look at some of the responses from it later in our conversation. So please fill it out. But first, I want to turn to my colleagues, Karen and Ron, and get their initial responses to what we just experienced, with a particular focus on the First Amendment. We heard that text at the beginning of the video, but as a reminder, here it is again. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So let's start a conversation. And I want to ask the first question very much related to what we just heard. And that is, which of the individuals in particular or individual really resonated for you and why? And I'm going to ask Karen and then Ron.
Well, thank you so much, Jack, for that context. And it's great to be here with both of you for this really important conversation. So many aspects of what we heard this evening really and truly resonated with me. And it's because there's a part that I really want to hone in on that you just read that highlights the importance of what we hear in the words peaceably protest or peaceably, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, right? Peaceably means without violence or war, inclined or disposed to avoid strife or dissension, not argumentative or hostile, not contentious or quarrelsome, free from strife or disorder, right? That's how we understand what it means to be peaceable. And so when you listen to the different presentations that we heard this evening, you heard David, who talks about a cold civil war, right? He talks about, this idea of January 6th being a turning point for American society. And I think that's really true. I was really struck by Matt, and what he talked about in terms of what does it mean to look at what we saw happen on January 6th as an American? And how do you not feel a sense of disappointment? The question that was raised, or the points that were raised about what it means to be from rural Pennsylvania and have your colleagues and friends who you've grown up with be a part of this. And what does it mean that the FBI is looking for them? They're on the FBI's most wanted list. I think it's sobering. It's sobering because so much of this is familiar, it's proximate. And I think it's made us kind of, or I hope it has, I hope it's made us really rethink and reimagine what does it mean? What does protest mean? What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be a patriot? And I know we're going to get to some of these questions a little bit later, but I think so many of our actors this evening were able to really highlight how we're grappling with what it means to be a citizen. How do we embrace this language, this context that is really meant to provide a sense of freedom and liberty for all of us? And how do you do that in a way that allows you to feel a sense of freedom, autonomy, liberty, and justice, while also recognizing that we may not see eye to eye? And I personally think that's okay. You don't have to agree with me, but there is something to be said about being peaceable in our protest, and for being civil, and for having a sense of mutual respect. And I think so many of the speakers were pointing to the fact that that sense of civility, that sense of respect for personhood definitely was not there on January 6th. There's so much more, but I'll stop there. Great question.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Ron?
Well, good evening to you, Jack, once again. And let me echo what Karen said, because I think the thing that resonated with me the most was the notion that perhaps in America, we're in a cold civil war. But I look at this cold civil war not from the marker of January 6th, 2021, but I trace this back to January of 1995. You had the Republicans take over the Congress for the first time in 40 years. And I worked on Capitol Hill for almost 9 years. And you could see that people were more identifying by party than they were on policy. And in order for me to win, Jack, you or Karen, you have to lose. I have to win, but in order for me to win, the two of you have to lose. And it seems to me that the art of compromise and the art of negotiation has been eroding in our country for many, many decades now. And what I saw on January 6th as one, and of course, one of our senior folks at the Bradema Center, Tom McIntyre, who also worked on Capitol Hill with me, we know where these places were. It was an invasion of the heart of democracy, of what our founders sought to establish and move away from tyranny. And yes, our First Amendment enshrines the right not only to have freedom of speech, but most importantly, to petition the government and peacefully assemble. And what I didn't see on January 6th was that idea that we could come together and peacefully assemble. I didn't get the feeling that we were petitioning the government in a responsible way. And it opens the door to those who say there was nothing wrong. This was not an armed insurrection. People were just merely being let in by others. But I think it opens the door to a much darker and graver set of politics that I think many of the students and many of us ought to be careful to reflect upon in the days to come.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate also that historical, this wasn't a one-time event. This has been building for some time. And one of the really interesting things is the research on partisanship. It's really the worst that it's been in over 100 years. And political scientists have measured that pretty carefully. And that partisanship has led to the kind of description that you've given of the way the legislature operates and the way people interact. So that's a really good, important historical context for this. The First Amendment doesn't, and when you read it, appear that difficult to understand. It seems sort of cut and dried. Why is this still today, after all these years, such a tough hot button issue?
Ron, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I think You take this back to what the founders were grappling with in the 1780s, that we had this notion of we've won, we are establishing our democracy, and you look at what those who did not want to have a Bill of Rights included as part of our Constitution, grappling with those who did want to have a Bill of Rights. And the notion of what is speech, right? I mean, is speech a written form that the framers were looking back in the 1780s? Arguably, yes. But now we're in the 21st century, and how do we define speech now? And is it a grassroots communication? Is it a letter to a member of Congress? Is it, emails on the internet? And I think people now, with the different avenues available of communication, of how do we speak, and what are the constitutional safeguards and boundaries that really govern those speaking opportunities for people to engage in that First Amendment right. And so when we look at this question, it amazes me the brilliance of what the founders were able to do over 200 years ago, but I certainly don't imagine that they envisioned so many forms of speech and communication that we all try to utilize to get our views and our thoughts across.
So does that imply, Ron, that say they might not have envisioned spending money on a campaign as speech, for example, because at least in our current time, speech is defined so broadly that it's not actually speaking or writing. It can be taking actions of one kind or another.
Jackie, you go back to President Washington and his farewell address, and what was the thing that he was warning Americans against? He was warning against political parties. And, I certainly think that they would roll over if they looked at Citizens United. But at the same time, you look at George Washington, and what was he doing to elicit votes, but giving out liquor? So, I mean, I guess one person's version of communication is money, and another is giving out liquor. So it's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, you make a good point there. Even if you look at some of the campaign rhetoric of some decades ago, it was pretty vitriolic. That wasn't invented just in the last 2 decades. That's definitely the case. Karen, it sounded like you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, I think part of it is it's the political rhetoric, but it's also how we think about, how society has evolved, right? And what we think about in terms of the party system, what that means for our political climate. And what really struck me when I was thinking about this panel tonight and kind of, the point that I wanted to make is that, what we're talking about in terms of issues related to freedom of speech, what it means in terms of freedom of religion and religious expression, what it means in terms of having this ability to peaceably assemble. I think there's really an issue with how we see each other as individuals, as citizens, personhood. And I think it was problematic in the 1790s, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because this historical challenge has been with us for some time. To whom is personhood esteemed, right? Who do we see as a full person? Who do we see as a patriot? Who do we see as a citizen? And I want to unpack that a little bit, but I think for me, when you're thinking about the Bill of Rights and when you're thinking about our political climate, our political system, I think part of what's missing is the idea of the framing, the preamble, and what it represents, right? It says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, right? So it's thinking about future. So it's not just, did the framers think about social media, right? And the different forms of social media, but how were they thinking about our future political climate? What does it mean to have the kind of citizenry realize their fullest economic, political, and social well-being? And is that what drives us as we think about our political campaigns and our political engagement? I don't necessarily think that that's what we're focused on. And I think those are the questions that the actors were really kind of raising. Like, how are we making society better? How are we, whether we agree or disagree in terms of how it's done, are we really promoting political, economic, and social well-being? And what does that look like, right? So I think those are important things to think about as we have these conversations. Are we creating policies? Are we, regardless of our political party, seeing eye to eye on what it means to have access to housing that's decent, right? To healthcare, to schooling. Those are things that all of our children, our family, and our communities have to have access to. And are we creating systems, processes, and policies that allow us to feel good about our communities and allow us to feel a sense of community, capital C, not lowercase c. And I think what we saw on January 6th was kind of an example of, when I saw everything that had happened, it made me think of, you know, all of the reading and the archival work that I've done as a historian, looking back at the Civil War. It was an example of domestic terrorism, right? That happened right here on our soil. And so you're seeing that reenacted, really. That's what we saw on January 6th. And it was really deeply troubling. But I think it raises some larger issues around how do we think about our community? How do we care for our community? And what does that mean in terms of how we act, how we treat each other, and how we think about future generations?
You know, I was thinking of asking this a little later, but you raised it now. And that is, what is a person, as defined by the First Amendment? And could you, either you or Ron, say something a little more about what the authors might have been thinking about and how that has evolved over time? Because that seems really essential to this, about who has the right in some ways to free speech. Is it everybody or not? So say a little bit about how that has been a key factor here.
Yeah, I'll just jump in right here really quickly to say, I think what we don't do is have historical context frame how we're thinking about these conversations. So for example, we know in 1790, the first official year of the US Census, the data that was collected was the number of free white males over 16, under 16, the number of free white females, the number of other free persons, and the number of slaves. We look 100 years later, which is 1890, when the census was taken, and that's when you see the beginning of the term race on questionnaires, which include white, Black, mulatto, quadroon, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and then in 1930, mulatto disappears and Mexican is added. And so we know that as we think about how the census data was used then, how it's used now, and how it's become, how race has kind of shaped this conversation in many ways, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that the idea of who is a person is not just an issue of race and how this conversation has become racialized, but the question around gender, I think, is very key too. And I go back to the 1790 census because we look at the number of free women, but then we see it's not until 1920 when women have the right to vote. So we just this past year celebrated 100 years of women having the right to vote in the United States of America. And that was ratified in the 1920s by Congress. So there's a lot that we're having to reconcile with as a nation in terms of personhood and what it means for racial equity and equality, and what it means for gender equity, gender equality, and gender expression. And so I think we're having as a society to really come to terms and grapple with what does it mean to recognize individuals within society as persons, as full persons, and how do we attribute the work that we do, the policies we create, the work we engage in across sectors in a way that treats people with their full humanity. And quite honestly, Jack, as a society, we've struggled with that. We struggle to give women the right to vote, right? And for them to be politically active and engaged in ways that they need to. We've seen historically the disparity of communities of color, not just African Americans, but other groups, people of color. And so when we look at that lack of political engagement, the lack of having the opportunity to vote, right? And then you think of 1960s when my mom was coming up, she went to segregated school and had to pay a poll tax. Why would you pay a poll tax if you're a citizen? So we see the penalties of what it means to have the wrong skin color, the wrong gender. And as a society in 2021, we're grappling with that still.
Yeah, well, just think of the effort to, the birther effort with President Obama defining who can be a person in the United States and a citizen. It's to this very issue, right? It's startling to think that's happening in the 21st century, but there it is. Ron, did you want to add anything to that, or?
I do, and you know, it's personal for me. You know, I as a lawyer, I look back to Dred Scott, the decision from 1857, which, without much argument, I think is probably the worst opinion ever written by the Supreme Court in looking at citizenship for what it means to be an African of African descent here in America. But you know, I fast forward and I look at my own evolution as a citizen, and exercising my right of the franchise to vote and aligning myself with one particular political party as being a Republican. And I have to say, when you hear the terms race, diversity, equity, and inclusion, most of the focus I've received has not been very diverse. It hasn't been very equitable, and it certainly hasn't been very inclusive. And you know, being called an Uncle Tom, being called a sellout to your race, and you're not authentically Black. I think if we're going to have an honest conversation about the First Amendment and about the freedom of speech, I find it interesting that there are only certain types of speech that I have really seen in the last 30 years of being in politics, that if you're a certain race, you're expected to vote or act a certain way. And if you don't, well, then you're not fully inclusive of the mainstream. And so I think that's a very important element that I wanted to bring to this discussion, perhaps for those who feel like I do, but also feel that their voice has been silenced.
That's a real interesting point. And that comes to something else that we need to discuss, and that's the relationship between freedom of speech and kind of canceling or cancel culture. And that can go in different ways, right? But how do we navigate this on colleges and campuses and in educational settings?
I think it's really tricky. And I say it's really tricky because, you know, my kids, I have an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old, and they've been educating me about cancel culture, right? And what that means in terms of—
They educate me about a lot of things that
happen. Yeah, absolutely. And so this idea of cancel culture, that's a newer phenomena, right? And it's really, when we think about it in terms of defining what it means, you know, it's a form of ostracism, right? When you think about social, professional, even political circles, when we think about the online presence of people in social media, there are mostly negative connotations around how we think about cancel culture, right? You said something that's not appropriate, that someone deems appropriate, or in many ways, I think people have tried to say it's not really equated with free speech or even censorship, but there's a form of correctness, and I wouldn't say even political correctness, but a way of kind of behaving or being that one expects by being in the public square, in the public realm. And so you're canceled if you don't really understand what it means to have this sense of, I wouldn't just say equity, but a sense of what's appropriate. And I think we have to really have a conversation about what does it mean to be appropriate? What does it mean to share your thoughts or views without getting canceled, right? So for example, if I said, well, you know, I don't like the color green, and someone's like, oh, you're canceled for not liking the color green. Okay, well, is that permissible? Well, yeah, but I think there are larger questions around things that are problematic. So for example, I think one thing that we've seen in particularly modern society is more issues around some systemic issues. So for example, sexual violence, right? So the Me Too movement and what we've seen in terms of women being not just violated in the movie and television industry, but in the workspace, not having opportunities for advancement or being sexually harassed. So I think the Me Too movement has raised these issues in a way that we haven't seen this kind of visibility before. And so there's no space for that kind of treatment or mistreatment of women. And I think with that, there's been a greater awareness or acceptance around what it means to harass women or to mistreat women or to treat women equally. I think on the other side of that, and I think that's a good thing. Let me be very clear. I think it's a good thing when we can call out behaviors, actions, or systems or patterns that have historically wronged particular groups, right? Like women. We've seen that happening. We've seen the data. We've seen the behavior and the consequences of those behaviors. I think the other side of that is where we get into what's called, quote unquote, political correctness, right? At what point do you not say what you think, or do you at some point create some rigidity around speech or what one thinks, to the point where people aren't able to share their thoughts in a space to learn. And I think particularly in higher education and educational environments, we have to be really careful about what does it mean to share one's thoughts and to create a space for free speech without being hateful, right? And one of the actors actually mentioned that, right? I think they were talking, kind of grappling with is there a space for hate speech and free speech? Mm-hmm. And my question is, well, why would you want to be hateful to anyone anyway, right? I'm like, I think unfortunately we've gotten to the point where we're having to define what does it mean to be hateful. And that to me is disheartening. How are we as a society not clear on what it means to treat someone with dignity and respect? We don't know what hateful means, but I think that's also because of my intersectional existence. I'm a Black woman from the South with a mother who grew up in segregated Virginia, right? So I have a sensibility and a way of being in society that makes me very attuned to what it means to treat people equitably, because myself, my grandparents, and my parents often weren't treated equitably. And so I think it's not just a question of hate speech and free speech, but a question of who's had the right to be able to articulate their thoughts, who's taken up space to the point where they have not allowed others to be free, right? To be treated equitably. And I think it's really now, I credit the women who've been brave and who've been courageous enough to call out those who've been mistreating women for all of these years. And so these movements, not just in acting or the media, we've seen the ripple effects in higher education, in technology, in business. We've seen these questions come to the fore in a way they never have before.
Yeah, you raise a couple of things that are quite interesting to me in particular, and one of those is systems harm to groups. I think of interacting around, say, due process and rape, for example. The view, it can be that, well, we have a rape culture, and therefore, any kind of support for the system or process and so on is actually harming and reinforcing that system. And then the other thing that is pretty, I think, common in the classroom also is harm in the sense of emotional harm. People say things that aren't violent in the sense of, shooting somebody or stabbing somebody, but they cause them emotional harm. And this has been extended to be inclusive of violence or harm as well. And you're alluding, I think, to both of those things, and they're not easy to navigate, right? But Ron, did you want to add something to this?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Going back to the core of your original question of, how do we address this in college campuses, and how do we make it a more welcoming environment? In addition to teaching at NYU and the DC campus, I also teach another university in Washington. And probably the most alarming thing, a group of students who came to me after class was, they said that we feel that your classroom is the only safe space that we have here in the entire university, because unless we act, unless we think, unless we in rote fall down with everyone else and say we agree, hook and ladder, then we're going to be ostracized. And I think that as educators and certainly administrators, it's incumbent upon us, those of us who are given the honor and the privilege to work with students and to help welcome them to take the fork in the road, that if the professors and the deans and the administrators are pushing students to believe one ideological viewpoint is better than the other, then I think that we fail on our mission. And so I come right up front and say, yes, I'm conservative, I'm a Republican, but my job is not to indoctrinate you. My job is to educate you. And that's what I'm here for. And I just would sort of urge our fellow colleagues that we're here as educators, not to indoctrinate others.
Great, thanks. Joe, did you have some responses from the audience you'd like to insert?
Well, yes, we included a question on the survey that's related to the conversation you've been having. So I just wanted to sort of throw some of this data in. So for the folks that have responded to the survey, they responded to a question, and there's a there's a spectrum of agree, somewhat agree, neutral, somewhat disagree, disagree. So the question or the statement was, I believe public institutions, including schools and universities, should revoke invitations to guest speakers when the speaker's remarks would likely offend certain groups of people. And 31% of those who answered strongly disagree with that statement. 28.6% disagree with that statement. So that's more than 50% of the group, has nearly 60% who disagree with that statement. And just as I was listening to you talk, I thought it would be interesting to throw that in as a point of reference that's in the survey that's come through so far. So
it sounds like there's quite a division though on that.
Yeah, I would say so. Then it looks like 14% are neutral, and then approximately 23.8% agree that folks should not be invited, or invitations should be revoked, and then 2.4% strongly agree that those invitations should be revoked. So it's about a quarter of the group that agrees strongly, or that agrees that invitations should be revoked.
Yeah. This is really a critical issue on almost all the campuses across the country. It has to do with invited speakers like this, but even in the classroom, right? Faculty have academic freedom. How does that balance with harm, possibly, that can be caused, as we were discussing earlier? These are not easy questions, but universities have academic freedom as such a fundamental right of faculty. Drawing, even though they're not drawing it directly on the First Amendment, almost all universities support the idea of academic freedom. So, any other comment on this before we go to another topic?
I just want to add in one more thing, if I may, Jack. I think this question of public, speakers and when they come to our campuses and what they have to say, if the idea is to educate our students and to train them, particularly at NYU, to be global leaders, then part of what we have to do as practitioners, as experts, as scholars in our field is to really think not only about our disciplinary expertise, but what does it mean to engage in critical pedagogy in the classroom, right? And I think, Ron, you were talking a little bit about this earlier when you were talking about creating a space in your classroom where students can have the idea to have a conversation and to imagine what that looks like along a spectrum. And I think so often, students come in the classroom and they have different lived experiences, different perspectives, and they're very passionate and they're very emotional at times, and it can be very heated. But I think there's more that we can do institutionally, not just here at NYU, but across institutions. There are ways of understanding and recognizing academic freedom, but also our institutional responsibility to engage in critical pedagogy, and what that means in terms of training our students to be able to discuss, debate, and to have these conversations, and to do so and still be able to have a conversation when you leave the room. You may not agree with me, you may not even like me, and that's okay. But can we say, okay, well, I see eye to eye on this, but I don't disagree on this? Or why is it that you think this, but you don't think, about this particular aspect, whatever it is? And I think that kind of critical pedagogy, that kind of creating a conversation for debate and engagement, and there's, I think, this real fear of people being somehow labeled, either racist or classist or sexist or whatever it may be for their thoughts or their ideology. And are there ways that we can grapple and have these conversations in the classroom, and maybe even in the dining hall, maybe even over a cup of coffee? My fear is that in 2021, we've become so polarized that we can't even have conversations about whatever it is that we may have our differences on, and find some common ground to move forward. And that's what I hope our students are committed to. I hope our faculty are also committed to that. Ways of really thinking about where there are distinctions, disagreements, and then what can we discuss in terms of common ground and ways we can move forward. And then also acknowledge there may be some areas we don't agree on. And that's okay. That's going to be okay. Maybe there's something we can learn, and maybe we need to come back to it and have a conversation later. But I fear that one thing we're not doing is preparing our students enough to have these conversations, to really understand the plurality that comes in conversation, what it means to have critical dialogue, critical debate, but also maintain a sense of civility and respect in the discourse. And I think that's sorely missing in the media and social media. We're seeing just a level of disrespect and a lack of decency that that should be there, and it's just not. And that gets back to this issue of personhood. If you really see me as a full person, you're going to at least try to understand my perspective.
Very good point. Thank you. Joey, you had some additional information.
The data supports what Karen just said from the survey. So I just wanted to say that a statement, I often seek out conversations with people that I do not ideologically agree with. And 35% of those who answered disagree with that statement. So it speaks to what you're saying, right? 33% are neutral, and only 24% agreed with that statement. So 25%. So it speaks exactly to what we're saying about how are we finding ways to have hard conversations with each other, even when we disagree. So the data from the survey supports what was happening in the conversation.
Great. I also wanted to pick up on something that one of the students focused on, and that was patriotism versus nationalism. And what came to my mind is, the sports figures kneeling, right, during the national anthem. Is that more patriotic in some ways than, carrying the flag? Could you say some thoughts on that? Because obviously this element of patriotism, America, and so on is an important ingredient in January 6th and in our conversation about freedom of speech. Ron, did you want to have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think patriotism can be defined by anyone in the manner in which they wish to define it, right? I love when I hear the national anthem to stand and I put my hand over my heart and I, say the words of the Pledge of Allegiance, whereas others might not feel comfortable. It's a very individual choice. I suppose my concern is that when others who have a differing viewpoint than yours try to impose their views or their values on you to silence your speech or to silence your ability to express your patriotism or love of country. And if you look at the revenues of the NFL and the National Basketball Association, they've plummeted. I think people want to go to the sports arena and they want to escape the world of politics around them. They want to escape the sort of vitriolic discourse that we see, and they just want to watch a football game or a basketball game. And I just only hope that if I want to stand at attention and you want to take a knee, that we can both look at each other and say, you know what, that's enshrined, that's your right, but just don't impose those views or values on others. And I respect you for holding that position.
Oh, good. Karen, did you have any thought on this?
Yeah, I want to come back to the distinction that you made, and I think it's an important and interesting one around what does it mean to be what does it mean, first of all, to be a patriot, right? And then this idea of patriotism versus nationalism. So when I looked it up, I actually said, well, what is a patriot, right? And it's defined as someone who vigorously supports their country and is prepared to defend against its enemies or detractors. And as a historian, I really grapple with this because, and particularly as an American historian, and I'm thinking of, part of what I've been kind of saying is, well, who stole patriotism? What is a patriot? And I think part of that comes from my orientation and appreciation for the narrative of early American history, right? So when we think about the Revolutionary era, in many ways, most Americans don't know anything about the Revolutionary War, or we think we know, and we have certain ideas about what it means. And for me, particularly as someone who looks at archival materials and who looks at, what can we learn? Who are people that we can learn from in early America? And there was a wonderful website that history.com, this is for the students, go do the work, go learn about America's history and legacy. And I was thinking about this term patriots, and there's actually a feature on their website. And I've talked about this before in my class with students. We don't always think of, when we think about who the patriots are, we don't go back to Crispus Attucks, right? He was what many historians credit as the first person to die for the American Rebellion, right? When we think about the idea of America rebelling against the British, Crispus Attucks, an African-American man, became the symbol of American patriotism and sacrifice in 1770. So we're thinking about the Boston Massacre, and he was a runaway enslaved person. And he really, and if you look at the historical archives, you see he emerges as one of the individuals who really can be credited as kind of embodying what it means to be a patriot. We don't do a great job in our textbooks or in our classrooms of teaching about him. We also don't teach about Peter Salem, right, who was actually enslaved in Massachusetts, which is a whole other story about slavery in Massachusetts. But his owners decided to free him so that he could remain enlisted. And it turns out he was in the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. And even though the British defeated the Continental Army, that was a turning point for the country, right? So that we were able to kind of galvanize ourselves to become independent from the British. And one other person I'll just mention really quickly is Phillis Wheatley. We often think about soldiers and those who laid their lives down so heroically and bravely, but what about Phillis Wheatley, right? She's a poet patriot, right? She was a revolutionary intellectual who actually penned a poem and wrote in support of George Washington and the work that he was doing with his troops. She wrote a poem to His Excellency General Washington, and actually was able to get an audience with President Washington because he was so enamored with her talent and her ability to really engage in an academic and intellectual way, while also being supportive of the work that he was doing. So the poetic becomes political, right? And I'm making this point because I think so often we have very rigid ways of thinking about what it means to politically engage. And you have someone like Phillis Wheatley, who was the first African-American and the third woman to publish in the 1790s. We don't know our history. We don't know about those individuals. They're people of African descent, but they're great Americans. And so often when we think about the narrative of American history and who's a patriot, who's paved the way, well, Amanda Gorman, who so wonderfully read her poetry at Joe Biden's inauguration, stands on the shoulders of Phillis Wheatley, right? And so we have this intellectual tradition, we have this political tradition, we have this tradition of people of color who served in the military for their country. And I think so often we don't pay homage, we don't pay recognition, and we don't really use our historical archives, which is where the Constitution is. I have a copy of this. I keep this in my office, a copy of the Constitution. And it's in.
I have one too.
But we don't really know, right? I see yours, Ron. We don't really know what it says. We don't digest it. And I'll get one last point, but I really get excited about this. And I'm thinking about so much of the work that I've done focuses on, as a historian, women from the civil rights movement. And a lot of people talk about Dr. King, but they don't talk about the women who worked behind the scenes to create these citizenship schools, which preceded the freedom schools. And the citizenship schools were all about voting rights, political enfranchisement. And they taught, their literacy classrooms were shaped around the Constitution. They taught people what the Constitution said. And so this idea of citizenry was not some kind of, intellectual far off idea. It was really tangible. It was real. It was like, this is what it means to be a citizen of this country. This is what it means to vote. This is what it means to be economically and politically enfranchised. And I think what that has meant somehow has not been communicated in our classrooms. Somehow we don't know this about our history. And so when we then have these conversations about who's a patriot, what does it mean to be, patriotic? Does it mean you stand when you hear the Star Spangled Banner, which my mother would have me to play on the piano and everyone would kind of rise. It was kind of like, this is a celebration of who we are as Americans. But I understand why Colin Kaepernick took a knee in terms of what he saw in society in terms of how Black people's lives were being, how they were being murdered or minimized or killed. There was a political statement that he was choosing to make and that others have made. And so I think we have to kind of unpack what it means instead of simplify it in a way that unfortunately happens a lot in the media. And these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having in our classrooms about around what does it mean to be a patriot? What does it mean in terms of when we think about nationalism? And what are those spaces that are artistic? How do they become politicized? Those sports arenas, how do they become politicized? And I think our students now, they're so much more sophisticated, and we need to have the space to be able to grapple with these very tough questions as we think about the future of our country and moving forward in 2021 in the midst of an ongoing global pandemic.
Oh, thank you, Karen. That was very eloquently stated. Unless I hear differently from Joe, it's 16 minutes after 7, and the time has flown by, and I think that's the time we agreed upon as the end of the program. So I want to just spend a moment thanking both of you, Karen and Ron, for your insightful, important comments. I really appreciate it, and this conversation. I also really thank the actors for the remarkable job that they did. It's just so powerful to see they're portraying these people and their views. And also want to thank the audience for attending and for putting forward their views. We look forward to see what some of the other survey results are. So thanks everyone. A hugely important topic, one that we'll grapple with here at universities, but it's also a national topic as well for national politics. And I really appreciate everybody. So thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.